So you have to be careful not to get this magnet near anything. It's a large pyramidal magnet. I wanted to actually read a tiny section off of one of my lectures, and it's about the laser analogy. We think laser radiation is coherent radiation, but that's only attributionally true. What actually defines a laser is point source emission, and that's not understood. And this is actually important not only for metaphysics, it's absolutely quintessentially important in defining what a magnet actually is. The amazing thing, I've been doing a lot of experiments with these dangerous and really powerful pyramidal magnets, is not only are they point sources with field coherency, but they're actually a point source that's brought to a point. So you actually have a multiplicative power amplitude where the Gaussian flux is approaching 1 Tesla right at the tip, for example. But I'm trying to keep this magnet away from all these electronics. But I'd like to give you an insight on into lasers, and this is applicable not only to physics but also metaphysics, that you weren't taught in school. That what actually defines them is point source emission. The incommensurability is spatially coherent, like a laser in the case of magnetism. Spatial coherent light has another name, sphere waves or plane waves, or even simpler, pinhole light or point source light. Coherent light is simple. It is light which comes from a very small light source. Light from a single source is always coherent, since incoherence requires at least 2 Cartesian sources. This is, of course, also the reason why LED lighting that everybody's using now, LED lights are bad for your eyes, but that's a matter for another discussion. And since incoherence requires 2 sources, this so-called lines of force seen in a magnet are merely constructive and destructive interference patterns of the polarity, i.e. the 2 sources of the centrifugal divergence and centripetal convergence. So the magnetism against the dielectric or plane of inertia, it can't actually exist any other way. This is the very definition of the ancient Greek term ananke, translated somewhat incorrectly as necessity, but what it means actually is that it can't exist any other way. Which kind of takes a long time to say that, but that's what the principle of ananke in ancient Greek means. It's not only a principle of metaphysics, it's also a principle of physics. A magnet, like a laser, is a field multiplicative phenomenon by which point source emission is not additive, but multiplicative in nature, where conventionally is meant power. A pre-magnet is quantitatively the same object, with nearly infinite mutually destructive sources at the level of the atoms and the molecules themselves. Upon becoming a magnet, there is point source incommensurability in the conjugate fields of the magnet, which then creates an ab extra field phenomena around a magnet. So to say, of course, a magnet emits absolutely nothing. What it is a field perturbation established by which the field perturbation is ab extra to the physical magnet itself, because not only is it point source, but it's incommensurable. In-phase emission is caused by the amplification of light, which does not cause coherent light, because the atoms emit light in phase with incoming light. They will amplify the light, but they amplify incoherent light as well, and they don't make it coherent. The coherence of laser light has another source. Laser light has 2 main characteristics. It is monochromatic, or of a very pure frequency. This is also called temporal coherence. Laser light also has point source characteristics of sphere waves and plane waves, referred to as spatially coherent. Starlight has coherence lengths in thousands of kilometers and millions, and starlight, of course, is far more coherent than human-made laser light, and the most distinct distant stars are just like ideal point sources. Astronomer A. Michelson discovered that the star Betelgeuse is far less coherent than other stars. Well, that's because it's our closest neighboring star. And Dennis Gabor, who invented holography before lasers existed, to create his pseudo lasers, he took light from an ordinary mercury arc lamp and passed it through a pinhole. Mercury's mission lines made it nearly monochromatic, and the pinhole gave it spatial coherence. So holograms were created before lasers actually existed, something I'm sure none of you know, or almost none of you. When a laser is first turned on, getting back to our laser analogy, it fluoresces. It emits light which is not coherent. Different random light phenomena start out from different parts of the laser. After a few thousand mirror bounces, all the light phenomena or field perturbations, I hate to say waves because there's no such thing as a wave. A wave is not a thing, but what a thing does. but for sake of convenience we could say waves here, have added up and subtracted this laser emission to form one single or point source EM emission. Most types of lasers actually emit spreading, non-parallel light. Lasers in CD players and in laser pointers and their semiconductor laser diode lasers, they create cone-shaped light beams, and if parallel beam is desired, they require focusing lenses, and they have focusing lenses. All the cheap laser pointers have plastic focusing elements. This is the same is true for lasers in inexpensive laser pointers that have these focusing elements in them. You take apart an old laser pointer and you'll find a plastic lens in front of the diode laser inside. Classroom helium neon lasers, which I grew up with, also create spreading light. Okay? People think of laser light as this, tight little lightsaber of light, and that's not what lasers do. They don't actually do that themselves. They have focusing elements. So these helium neon lasers, for example, create spreading light. The laser tube within a typical classroom laser contains at least one curved mirror called a confocal arrangement, and it creates light in the form of a spreading cone. It's a little-known fact that manufacturers of classroom lasers traditionally place a convex lens on the end of their laser tubes in order to shape the spreading light into parallel beams. While it is true that a narrow beam is convenient, I suspect part of the reason is to force the laser to fit into our stereotype that all lasers produce this thin, narrow lightsaber of light, and they don't do that themselves. But customers would complain if they got just a laser only, because it would create this spreading cone of light. We've been brought up to believe that laser light is parallel light, and that's bullshit. It's point source emission. That's why it is so powerful, but it does have to be focused. In the case of, I'll bring this on to, and there's no difference between, we're talking about point source emission, we're talking about a magnet, and this is a multiplicative. I'm trying not to get it close to my computer here. This is a multiplicative, this is the one and only time in the world you could actually say pyramid power is actually real. In a traditional conventional magnet of any shape, we actually have point source emission where there's a plane of inertia along the midpoint, and everything else is centrifugal divergence as defined by the term polarity, which I'm not going to do here, which would take a long time. But this is a multiplicative point source. What does that mean? Well, the magnet itself has point source emission, and we actually have the field coherency that actually defines a magnet. Because of any shape, before a magnet becomes a magnet, its quantitative value is 100% the same before it becomes a magnet as it is after it becomes a magnet. Therefore, what defines a magnet if there is zero quantitative change? Well, there's a qualitative change in that we actually have field coherency or point source emission. And of course, magnetism is merely the dielectric field. It's the expression of that centrifugal force vector, and centrifugal force is polarity by definition, which is not merely two-dimensional, it's also three-dimensional, and then we end up with this geomagnetic precession that actually defines the reciprocating precessional hyperboloid, this conjugate geometry of force and motion, inertia and acceleration, i.e. the magnetodielectric. The dielectric geometry is hyperboloidal, i.e. hourglass shape, and the magnetic geometry is toroidal or donut shape, and the superimposition of those is a perfect sphere, by the way. But this point source emission defines everything, both in physics and metaphysics. All branches of pure high wisdom aspect ratio, metaphysics and monism, both Greek and Indian and Egyptian, and those are the only good ones that have ever existed. There is nothing that comes within a million miles of wisdom and intelligence as far as true spirituality or true metaphysics. And I hate to use the word spirituality because that connotes religion, which religion is BS. Religion is secularized metaphysics. True metaphysics, of course, is the only true spirituality that the earth has ever known. Ancient Greek, Pythagorean, Platonic, Neoplatonic. One example would be Advaita Vedanta. The principal Upanishads, Brihadranika Upanishad, on and on and on. These are the only intelligent forms of true monism. They've all expressed the same thing, that what actually defines a point source Coherency is also the very same thing that actually defines true monism or spirituality or true metaphysics, i.e. theurgy, or as the Greeks called it, epistrophe. Protos is the emission, the effulgence of the absolute or the agathon outwards, and of course the euristostaios, or the extraneous absolute attribute, of course, is no different than light and illumination. The attribute of water, which is that it's wet, so on and so forth. The refulgence, or in the ancient Pali, avidya, which unfortunately is translated as ignorance. Well, what it means is the extrinsic attribute of the absolute. That the theurgy, or the synthesis, or transcendence, if you want to use crappy English conventional terminology, transcendence from the empirical requires this apophaticism, this via negativa, this synthesis or theurgy with pure subjectivity. It would be the same difference between a spiritually perfected person being analogous to a magnet who has point source. Everything is perfectly coherent. The field extends outside of the actual physical object itself, and it absolutely has no incoherency of itself. It attracts like to like. Dielectric acceleration is amplified once this becomes a magnet. The same is true of the person. What's the difference? We're actually talking about what is a potential versus what is actualized. It would be the same difference between like melting down rock to extract out, the crummy matrix from the gold. I mean, it'd be the synthesis, sort of the disillusionment of objectivity. All true forms of monism and metaphysics. And modern people today think that this is physics and this is metaphysics. You'll actually talk about a topic and someone says, well, that's metaphysics. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in physics. Someone that is actually wise knows that physics and metaphysics are just opposite sides of the same goddamn silver. It's like, this isn't a silver coin, but, it was an older coin. Like this entire coin is silver, right? There's no such thing as physics versus metaphysics. There is only the absolute truth, which is the silver of the coinage. This is, of course, where modern minds fail, and they fail very, very often, as they fail to make a distinction between the fact that there's no such thing as a distinction between physics and metaphysics. They're both one and the same thing. The actual true spiritual attainment, or theurgy, or the ancient Greek epistrophe, or the ancient Pali term udam soto, which means going upstream to the source waters, is this theurgy, or spiritual synthesis, or the making coherence, the disobjectification between the self and the not-self, which is the persona non grata, or the psychophysical, or in the ancient Pali, namarupa. The most repeated phrase in ancient Indian Prakrit metaphysics is isokaya lamisata rupa anatati. The psychophysical is not myself. Not myself as meaning this person of flesh and blood, forms, feelings, impulses, consciousness, but the true self. There's always been the same thread running throughout all forms of monism, both Greek and Indian, is that there are two selves, the false self, i.e. the empirical self, and the transcendent self, the ontological self. It's the same difference between, people confusing the radio with the actual signal. Obviously, if you smash the radio, what the hell does that do to the signal? The answer is it does nothing to it. This is also the meaning, the true meaning in metaphysics of the dead man walking. That means a person who's died to the physical self, but lives already before dying physically, living within the ontological or metaphysical self. So the actual string and thread, and by the way, that's what the term sutta means. It means a thread, i.e. the thread of wisdom upon which the pearls of truth are strung. I don't know if you've ever heard that one before, but that's what the term sutta. It's kind of a poor way of saying scripture. It is always an allusion to, is the theurgy, or the synthesis of the self to the self, because in all forms of monism also, there is no distinction between the soul and wisdom. The self that seeks itself is the ultimate wisdom. There is absolutely no distinction between illumination, wisdom, and the soul. They are all, in all branches of true monism, one and exactly the same thing. The same is true in Pali. Vidya, or wisdom, and the Atman are one and the exact same thing. Everybody today, of course, has no idea what true metaphysics is. They're engaged in stupid things called meditation, which actually are not disobjectification. They sit there and they blank out their mind like a pet rock, and that bullshit has absolutely nothing to do with metaphysics. Nothing whatsoever to do with it. I almost placed this magnet on top of this thing, and I remembered I had my iPad underneath there. If I did that, I would have erased my iPad. That's not good. I hope you like these videos. If you did, you could always drop a buck or two. Click the link below. Tell me how much you hated them. Whatever makes you happy. Catch you later.